Hello, everybody. Good morning, New Zealand. Good evening, Sweden, and good afternoon here from Saxby, North Carolina. Sunny and 87 degrees. It's a lovely day. Kate's got layers on, so looks like it might be a little chilly there. Mm-hmm. Angus spent the day reading in the garden.
Yeah.
It's spring is sprung and fall is fell in New Zealand. Spring is sprung in Europe and in the States. Okay, so there's my radio voice. I'm going to move into this is episode 5, and it's the question, the Isot question. And for me, as directly in opposition to Angus, this is the most important question one could ask, I think. What is the nature of the Isot problem? And just to frame it specifically, the Isot question has been framed as the notion that you can't get an ought from an is. From reality, scientific reality, say you can't get what you're supposed to do, what one should do, what is normative, what is moral. And in the first part, John does a pretty good job of problematizing, defining the way in which David Hume and others, Moore and others, sort of try to solidify this, and then he sort of gives some middling reasons why you can't separate the two so easily, say. What I want to say is that to ask the question, what is at stake with this? And I'm gonna frame that in relationship to Zak's fourfold meta-crisis, his description of the meta-crisis. And I'm suggesting he's missing one, but they're also quite important. So the first part of this is the sense-making crisis. So for children, that's all of the interventions we've talked about in the past, the ways in which we are intervening on the will forces as they are coming into being in relationship to a world around them. So there's technological interventions, pharmaceutical interventions, and of course those are creating long-term crises in the ability to make sense of the world as they grow into adults. And it's also hijacking developmental processes, and as we've seen, that's a problem. If you miss a phase of development, then the downriver problems of remediating that are made that much more difficult. And for us, for adults, the problem sort of manifests as the subject-object dualism, and so I'll start there, and herein lies where the problem of this Isot problem that has been concretized and was concretized through Kant. Now they can talk about all of the ways in which they can't be so easily separated and that they're conflated, and we'll get into that, but they didn't get into the problem at its root. And the problem at its root was what Kant added to this Humean notion that you can't get an ought from an is by wedging in between reality and morality the thing in itself. So it really shouldn't be described as an Isot problem. That's a fallacy. So the naturalistic fallacy is that you can't derive an ought from an is, or the idea that you could is an impossibility. That's the naturalistic fallacy that's formally put. What I'm suggesting is that we're not talking about an is, we're talking about an it. We're talking about the objectification of nature and the negation of the affective, subjective self in relationship to nature, as if it were just some sort of addendum or at very least lesser valued, right? And so this is where Kreinbuhl comes in, and Steiner uses him in the Philosophy of Freedom and talks about negative spiritual activity as the actual thing that enters the room at that point, and it will not, and sort of forms an opening for the moral impulse, which is the other half, the ought part, a sort of opening to investigate the moral impulse from a phenomenological standpoint. Now, he doesn't say that, but that's the way Steiner uses him, and then goes on in Philosophy of Freedom to talk about moral imagination. And so our problem, and we're living with this in Western society, nobody knows what to do. So we have, on one hand, we have this moral absolutism from prefigurative religious life. And on the other hand, we have this sort of moral relativism that eschews any grand narrative at all, or human thinking or at all, or as we referred to at the end of our last video, when Zak Stein says the answer to postmodern relative subjectivity is to abandon modernity. And if we're going to answer the moral question, the biggest moral questions of our time, and if we're going to solve the meta crisis, we're going to have to de-objectify the natural world on one hand and take seriously the interior sciences on the other. Now, unfortunately, they don't in this video bring the interior sciences as the answer to the Isot problem. They do in the next video, and that's what that one's all about. And they go further into Sri Aurobindo. So to complete this picture of the fifth crisis that I would say encompasses the meaning crisis, Zak brings in the problem of credibility, meaning, legitimacy, and sense. And we touched upon meaning. Actually, we started with sense. So if we move into meaning, the meaning crisis, meaninglessness, we have in children, we have introducing intellect too quick, again subverting the will as a place for learning about the world in a sound way that they can feel comfortable in their bodies as they incarnate. And this hyper-intellectual intervention sort of subverts reverence, which Steiner refers to. A reverent attitude later turns into a sense of truth, which is how we get meaning. And it also subverts attention, which is the will at the level of perception. So now you have meaning subverted, and then you also have the ability to attend to things and make sense out of things. So this is what we're doing to our children. This is why the Isot problem is the question of our time, I would say. In the adult, the problem is that we start from an it-ought perspective, and which means that we start with a reality in and of itself, neglecting a morality. And we don't even have the reality, because we have an abstraction, a metaphysically real abstraction placed in between morality and reality. And so we start in the Enlightenment at a simulative place. So all we can do is simulate through theory, modeling, mind technology. No wonder we seek our meaning, because in the sort of unintended or default exoteric world of technologies themselves. For adults, that also means scientism. So because there's no moral impulse, the only way we can decide how to do things, why to do things, the ought side of it, is because it's a fact, because it's a scientific fact, or it's a statistic that has been demographically measured, or it's an epidemiological description of 30 people getting sick at a church, and so that proves that it is the cause that is already presumed from the simulative standpoint. So that's a picture of the scientism. And then we have a capability crisis. So nobody knows how to do anything, including making meaning or sense out of the world. right? And so for kids, what we're seeing in schools is training for outmoded capabilities. So the very thing that they're getting trained for and sort of commodified into moving into a workforce is all illegitimate by the time they get to adulthood anyway. So, they're looking at the adults going, you people don't know what you're doing. And we're creating this teacherly authority problem that Zak also addresses. For adults, this means truncated ontologies, narrow goal sets, say, careerism, this sort of thing. And that's the best we can do in capability, is to get ourselves, keep our jobs, bureaucratize, create technocracies that essentially do our work for us. And we become increasingly ignorant of life, how to garden, how to fix a car, how to cook, how to do math, how to think for oneself. And so that leads to a legitimacy problem, right? So that the children are going, as I mentioned, I can't rely on you. I can't rely on the soundness of my senses. And so there's a delegitimization from the inside out and from the outside in. For adults, there's no such thing as truth, right? So this is the thing that happened in the States, and I'm sure around the world, when around the time of the hypernormalization that manifests itself as mass stupidity in Donald Trump's election, right? And all the things surrounding that on both sides of the so-called aisle. And so these are indicators of a meta crisis. And I'm going to lay this problem not at the feet of meaning, which most people do, but at the feet of morality. We don't have a reliable ontology and epistemology at getting at greater and greater intimacy with reality. And up to this point, they would have been with us here. During this video, they don't ever really get to it. They never really get to the vital importance of the problem of morality and the way in which it's been conflated with fact. They talk about it. They talk about the problem, and we'll get into that. But they don't have an answer. So what I'm going to do is charge us with an actual infrastructural answer to this. What is the procedural epistemology that provides for a moral framework, or a moral ability, or a moral sense making of the world? And I think that is the introduction that I wanted to give. Yeah.
Do you want me to run the video there?
Yeah, the cue Zak, because I think that he sums up and then sums up what John has to say here as the problem, and then typical Zak extends it a little farther out.
Okay.
Ending of those two,
Yeah,
right? But also, for good practice, require the keeping them distinct. And this is the thing I'll say, which is that we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater of modernity. Like the distinction of the value spheres, which you mentioned, the Kantian kind of distinction of the value spheres, and Weber talks about it, and Habermas kind of reifies it in an interesting way in the Pragmatics of Communication. That's a pretty important innovation, which stops certain kinds of language practices, which we all instinctually rebel against as moderns, which is to say, when someone applies descriptive language from a religious ontology like which is both an ontological and an evaluative claim at the same time. And there's no opportunity to say, hey, wait, do which actually exist as a separate question from how do we value which? Like, there's no separation of science from ethical conversations. There's a merging of basically authoritarian forms of truth and traditional forms of truth with social practice, and then merging them together. Right? And so that was very important to overcome and actually change the nature of how we justify different types of claims. That justifying an ethical claim is different from justifying a scientific claim. And this is actually where it gets tricky to say that certain things, that it's true that something is good, is correct, but it's a different kind of truth, if you will, than to say X number of people have X number of cases of COVID, right? Very different kinds of truth. Now, I think it's okay to say it's true that some things are good, but we have to be careful to think about what's the evidentiary basis upon which we make that claim. Yes. And this is why Habermas, although he tries to overcome the differentiation that goes into disassociation and then retroactive hegemonic dominance, which is what it's because it's not just that they've become separate, it's they become separate and one's the kind of weaker player, right? That it's not just that Moore says they're separate, he's also saying this is basically irrational, like all the values stuff.
That was where you wanted to run to, wasn't it, Jeff?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's where I wanted to run to. Run to you, run to you. Mm-hmm. Okay, so here we are. The affectation, subjectivity, all that's just to be set aside for what ends up being conflated Puritanism, it looks like to me. So you have, so Zak brings up the term witch, right? That was at a time in Salem, Massachusetts, and I think there was a time before that in England, or there was a similar time.
I believe, yeah.
There's the hunting and persecuting of people deemed to be witches. So that claim is both you're a witch, which is real, and that's bad, and you have to prove yourself not to be a witch. So if you float when we try to drown you, then you're a witch and we'll kill you. So you just got no way out, right? So this is a problem, of course, in Puritan religion. It's also a problem in Puritan scientism. It's a problem in puritanical social justice movements, right? Within the climate movement, the social justice movements, scientism. It runs right through all of our culture because we can't separate the is from the ought. Now, if that's not an important question, I don't really know what could be an important question. Whether it's race, religion, pandemics, right? He mentioned the COVID cases, right? How can you determine the COVID cases when you're using when you're putting value on a testing device that the creator of the device had suggested was not appropriately usable for that purpose, for diagnosis? First of all, so what's the motive then for doing that? Is it a conflated motive with value? Is it try to get a bunch of people to do things? I mean, even if that were a good intention, the conflation, the behaviorism that associated with that, conflating a value that it's good, it's better for the greater good to get a bunch of people on board a narrative that you want by using faulty scientific devices to develop the is that you ought to do, right?
Yeah. Oh, I don't want to jump in yet.
It's okay. Hang on. Somebody was at the door, but they went away, though, the 12-year-old says. So we don't have a science of what it is to what we ought to be doing. So what shall we do?
Yeah. I feel like people think they do have a science of what they ought to be doing, and that's why we had what COVID was. because of that conflation, where scientific fact is used as a value making frame. But to me, I don't know. This clip confuses me because I get the witch thing, but I also don't really. Because I feel like people do that all the time with science, you know? I feel like that instinct hasn't gone away from people.
I agree with that. I agree with that. But what do you think about my, let's say, thesis here that science is inevitably going to do that if there's not a phenomenology of what a moral what morality would be and how it's achieved.
I'd like to come in on just the use of the word science, because that you've got this conflation going on there as well. There are the results of the scientific process, which is called knowledge, and then there's science, which is the process. And most people like conflate those two, and so they just let's say a product of science is the method. It's not. And that's why Fauci could never have been right when he said, I am the science, and all the other idiots who are saying the same thing. So I think that's linking the description of the witch there specifically to the use of the word science is it's useful in this conversation.
Yeah, I feel like I am quite struggling with this video because I guess, okay, when I watch it and when I listen to them talk about the Isot distinction, and John goes very deeply into it, and the whole time I'm going to say something in my spirit is sort of saying, but there's a difference between a still fact and a moving fact. Do you know what I mean? Like the process of time makes things different, and I feel like a phenomenology of morality takes into account that you can't make a claim that stays the same forever. You can't make a moral claim that's finished. That's one and only. There's there's developing claims, and that's actually the project of morality, is that it's always developing.
So this is my argument about science. About science as well. You can't make a factual claim that remains the same. If evolution is evolving, right, and if matter is not inert, if everything is in some sort of process, then isness itself is immorally claimed to be an itness when it's made a static, as you're describing this. A still fact. A still fact is a lie after some time. It's scientific discovery is a it's just that. It's discovery, which is a process, right? And so what we're doing is punting on the consequences of the results of scientific discovery, and calling technology science as well. So yes, I agree with you, and we're doing the same thing with science. And as Angus was saying, the product of science isn't the methodology, and the science is a process. And when science itself, and Gregg says this too, it's maddening that he actually agrees with it, right? It's in a certain sense that medicine in a way is the ought, and biology is the is. And it's an understandable thing that they're it's not understandable. Like medicine should be based on biology. And as you say, biology is the life world in process. So, mechanical theories of cells aren't going to cut it for producing what we ought to do in relationship to health.
Yeah.
Does that?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it makes me say that what we need to do is develop capacities of ways of seeing. Like, is that what you mean by the internal sciences? Work on our ways of making meaning or ways of seeing, so that we can be put into. We can be, as a doctor, I can be in different situations with different patients who present with symptoms I've never seen before. But because I am trained in a way of seeing and a receptivity, I can trust that I will, hopefully make the right decision. I can trust in my ought making ability. I mean, not say that I'll be right every time, but yeah, it comes back to me rather than I can learn all the facts about a scenario, but what that does is just sort of create a procedure rather than an original a participation in what's going on when you have a patient. So you have to proceduralize everything because you have to take into account to these still dead facts. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I would propose is not an interior science or an exterior science, but a liminal science. So the science would stand between the percept and the concept. It would be observationally attuned to the percept and developing that part of and the knowing is what happens in between, just like in music. Mm-hmm. It is what happens relationally with the world. So interior science is helpful, and this is why they go into Sri Aurobindo and the way in which there's the products of interior science help us understand. For example, Steiner's ninefold human being, Steiner's sevenfold human being, the threefold human being. These are very helpful products of spiritual science, but we all have to be in the liminal space to receive the proof, say, and the proof that these guys seem to want is something exoteric, even when it comes to the moral value structure.
Yeah, that's what I was meaning. By liminal, your liminal science is what I mean. What we learn in philosophy of freedom about the way that we create knowledge out of our percepts and concepts. Yeah, and I think I've been saying this a lot, that it comes back to trust. I have to trust right now that you are looking at me differently because right now your faces are frozen and look really cross. But I just have to trust that you're. But so it's hard to. It's quite. Oh, I feel on the spot. But
I'll have to.
Yeah, I keep saying this that we can't. We need to trust in something. Do you know? Can you help me change the? I would like to figure out a distinction between trust and faith, where it's not. Faith is not sort of this. Faith is kind of a negative spiritual activity in a way, or acting. Oh, is that what I mean? Well, faith means that we're not free if we can only have faith. But I feel like trust means you can be free because you trust in your sense making, and this is what we do all the time. There is no is-ought distinction in real life and in relationships because you just, at some level, trust other people and trust yourself. To figure out what to do, and there's no theoretical reasoning. There's just what there is and what you do about it.
Yes, and you would agree, I'm sure, that trust. By the way, I have only warmth in my heart, no matter what my frozen face looks like. It's just, my frozen face is a still fact, and I'm a process.
Yes, I
fact.
know. Exactly.
Yes, I forgot what I was going to say, but this gets at it. This gets at what it is that we're trying to do here as a project in relationship to these people is to build something alongside of the more static picture that they've sort of left themselves with. I would say particularly John and Greg. When it comes to morality, they seem to have hit the wall here.
And so, I think talking to your point there, Kate, I think when we're working through the philosophy of freedom, and like as we come into like a closer experience, direct experience of the universal activity of thinking and how that is a reality, that's going beyond faith. That's talking to direct experience. And as you deepen that by in meditation, in prayer, concentration, whatever your preferred method is, then that exceptional state leads to new insights, new abilities to trust that faculty, the faculty by which we can, the faculty by which we can say anything about anything, because knowledge without thinking is impossible. But also which is at the absolute essence of our being. I mean, without like developing it, when he talks about we live by the grace of thinking, this isn't some pretty, it's like sentimental romantic idea that he's suggesting there. It is based on direct experience of how this spiritual activity works in us. So I think that's when you were talking, that's what I was understanding.
Thank you. Those are good words to put to what I was trying to get to.
Do you want me to roll on to the next one there, Jeff?
Yes, let's do that. Let me give
25.
Let me get a little introduction to it. This is where I think Zak starts to take a sort of proactive turn. Like, that's a cheap word, but he starts to take up the notion that we have to apply as much reason to value as we do to a scientific discovery, say, and that value is grounded in its own ontology. So let's roll.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Right. We talked about ADD and ADHD last time.
Yep.
Right? And the question of like the scientific label of ADHD could be legitimately described as a descriptor to that child. Whether it's bad or good he has ADHD is a different question. And this is where it gets very tricky, especially in the domains of psychology. The use of descriptive language, smuggling in crypto-normative assumptions, and actually driving through normative agendas on the back of scientific data without having the normative conversation separately, distinct, but related from. And so as much as I want to blur that distinction, I'll talk about Bhaskar's fact value helix, which attempts to do that. You also want to maintain them as distinct and not smuggle all reason into the scientific truth stating category, and actually find a way to make as valuable and as important, which ends up being a form of moral realism, the discussions that we have about what value is. And that's something that became very clear as I started to see the application of psychological models in domains like education, where you get this attempt to do away with the deep forms of ethical conversation that need to take place and replace them with scientific conversations, which is one of the problems. And it's interesting to note that that's the problem Kant was trying to avoid. Like Kant, he did the whole thing to save morality and faith from scientific encroachment, right? And he actually took those discourses more seriously than scientific discourses, in the sense that he thought that they were primary to our being, more so than the fact stating discourse. Not that they're separate, but so I think that there's a deep retelling of the history, which has to do with not just the separation of them, but the separation and then the dismissal of half the equation.
Right.
And so the resuscitation of and saying, hey, we can blur this distinction, means we actually need to resuscitate a whole discourse that we forgot how to have about the nature of value, and not start having this discourse like we have scientific discourses, which is what evolutionary psychology does and a lot of other fields, where actually, no, you're missing the point. Like, the evidentiary basis for making a claim that it's good that something is true is not something we end up hashing out through statistics at the end of the day. And so this is a deeper conversation about the grounding of the normative, where it is and how it differs in aesthetics from ethics, from science, how they're all related. So this notion of distinct but inseparable is an important notion. And then the notion of the helix, which Bhaskar uses to resolve the problem, which is useful in psychology in particular. And I can get into that because there's
Okay, so do we think that reality and morality are distinct but separate?
No. No.
So the way in which we choose things, the way in which we develop a moral imagination about something is the same as the reality out of which it's drawn from?
Are you going in the direction, Jeff, here of how it's like societies create moral structures, and it's like you've got like complete selfishness, it's like at the base level, and then you get enlightened selfishness, and then you get like family, you get family moralities, and then you get religious moralities, and then so you get to Steiner's idea, so like ethical individualism. Is that what you're talking to here?
Yes, I'm talking about reality as opposed to what we think is ideal. Like it'd be great if like they just came in a package to us, morality and reality, like what to do, what I should do in my life in relationship to the knowledge that I've gained. Is that knowledge reliable? Is it relatable to reality to the degree to which I can be sure that the morality, that when I say morality, I want to be clear. I'm not saying a proposed structure of ideological pictures of what is good. I'm talking about the liminal decision-making process through moral imagination, plucked out of a moral intuition. Right. So that to me is what we're referring to in the previous clip in conversation is spiritual science. So we're doing spiritual science, but why? Right? What value does that have? What value does it bring besides just personal joy? And so, yes, Angus, I am talking about this, the reality of the sequence that we move through in order to get to, right? So these guys talk about justification systems as if we were systems that resulted out of our neurological grounding as that justifies knowledge on one hand and justifies morality on the other. And that all we do is justify by pinging in relationship to the nature of not the nature of things, but the nature of our social environment, something like that, right? So, and that's true for me when I was 12. Like I was needing to affirm and compare my perspective as relates to reality, the reality around me. I didn't have a grasp on reality, and I wasn't a moral person necessarily. I didn't make the is-ought distinction, right? That didn't happen till later, but it definitely happened when I wasn't sure about my decisions being based in reality. And so, yes, I guess I am talking about that as a developmental process. And the reason why this is the most important question of our time is that we've separated it, truncated the reality out of which moral impulse arises, as I've mentioned, and we've privileged facts and ignored that there's value in all of those facts. So I agree with you, Kate, in principle that there's no different, that they're not distinct. They're not they're isomorphic in that they are part of an organism that is in dialectic, say. Right, in the last video we talked about verification. Like spiritual science needs to be verified, right? It does. Like the conclusions of spiritual science need to be verified, but the verification process is a true peer review that happens in your liminal, in my liminal processing, right? So this is an area where science has gone completely wrong as well, because it demands a sort of democratized knowledge, like that thing I shared from the Chat GPT, right? Like Steiner's great innovator and influenced a lot of people to do really great things, but people don't really accept him. So it's probably not a valid approach, the spiritual science. People question whether there can be an empiricism associated with it, right? So I don't know why I went on that aside, but
can you remember the exact question you asked, Jeff? Because I did want to come back to it and relate it to the whole tenor of this conversation, which has been really problematic for me, as I've told you already. But can you remember exactly how you worded the question to us? You've gone mute.
It's what Zak was saying at the end there, that they're distinct but not separate. Something like that. They're I don't remember exactly the words he said.
Okay, I'll try and talk around it, and you correct me if I go off in a wrong direction here. But one of the things that's bugged me since the beginning of these conversations is this talk of normative. Not that it's problematic, but that it's always falling short of that final step of ethical individualism. We all understand the value that organized religion and societal structures, how they all contribute to like the moral growth of the individual. What I hear them trying to do they want to create a new normative justification system and complex adaptive systems, behavioral investment systems, propositional justification systems. No, sorry guys, you're barking up the wrong tree. Because this is where spiritual science is fundamentally different. We are all individual species. We are individuating. It's your normative system that might be true for you. That's so. Once I get, the closer I become to being a true individual, the further I am from your normative system. So what they're trying to do, they're trying to converge on, let's call it, they talk about the religio often. It's a good example to take. They want to create a new religio. They're afraid of calling it religion. I understand that, but they're still trying to do that. They want to put everybody through the same funnel. And that's where we have to fundamentally, as people who take Steiner's ideas seriously, say, no, sorry, you've got nothing to offer me here. Your insights about how people are good, but don't talk to me about creating normative systems that people have to follow through on. But that's I've been carrying that for like 2 or 3 episodes now, because every time they say it, I feel myself going, yeah, I can understand the value of that, but that's where we're moving away from, guys. But you seem to want to drag us right back in there.
Yeah. Well, I'm just gonna come out and be confused, and you can help me. Like, I don't understand why, like the ADHD example. ADHD is a fact. Is that fact good or not? I don't know when that question is ever asked in real life. Is it good in the context? Can I do something good with it? or is it better to change it? Those are questions that we ask. But good is not tied to a fact ever.
No, but bad is.
Is it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. All the time. That's why we medicate children who are on ADHD, and so that they'll sit at a desk for 6 hours without being able to learn in the style that they are in. And then furthermore, we don't want to say it's bad in the sense that our culture might be creating it through undermining of sense apparatus in the early the first 7 years. So we completely skirt around the issue of the moral problem of A, stigmatizing children, and B, doing nothing fucking about it, because we got to normalize it. And it's just, yet we do both things in the same act in public institutions all the time. Furthermore, as relates to this clip, this idea that my wife is an English teacher and an administrator, but increasingly kids, she teaches say a kind of a beautifully epistemologically rich approach to literature and art, basically. And then she brings in other forms of art, the Harlem Renaissance and jazz, and the way blues is manifest in African American literature. It's just beautiful. Some of the greatest literature in the world comes from the Harlem Renaissance, and she uses terms like archetype, right? Because artists are plugging into something that is archetypal. It's spiritual, and they don't even know their intentions often. And so when one reads a literature in a say proper way, in a thoroughly capable way, you then discover what's universal about it. The kids are like increasingly like, that's not scientific. Why do we have to know about archetypes? That's not scientific. That's superstitious, something like that, right? Increasingly, the conflation of fact and value, fact and capability, fact and meaning, are just being crunched more firmly together.
Yeah, and this kind of comes into the metrics thing, right? Because what is the point of learning about literature and learning about archetypes? Oh, so I can pass an exam, so that I can meet a certain metric. So, and yeah, but I'm also confused because is bad and good, I don't want to go too far off, but I'm just being honestly confused. Is bad the same thing? Is it a similar claim to goodness? I don't think it is.
That's a really good question. Yes, I do think it is.
You do think it is?
I do, yeah. I do, and now that I think about it, I had never. I've always thought, well, morality is both things. Like it either falls out as that which is that which is definably good, no matter how you do it. Let's say, and that which is definedly bad. But it's a value judgment. That's why the notion of value underlies both good and bad. It incorporates both of those concepts. So they're distinct but not separable.
Yeah. Because, for example, from my experience of morality, it's not choosing between two. I feel like I am aspiring upwards towards goodness, towards godness, and things that don't fit with that, my individual picture of that, as I'm learning about my moral limits, fall away. Bad things fall away, but they're bad because they're falling away, and they're not right for my life, and they're not right for my morality. They don't align with the good that I'm reaching for. It's not that I'm choosing between two all the time. It's that and I think Crime Mule talks about this, like positive spiritual activity is always being shaped by the things that it defeats. That it's not. It's the heroic impulse rising up and meeting its situations and defeating its lower impulses always. And not because they're necessarily bad, but because they're not right for the situation. And that as you continue to make judgments, the moral picture of you becomes more clear. That to me, and I suppose it's just it's a process, and that's the words we need for morality as are always going to be processual. They're never, you can't keep them stagnant, because I don't know, that's how I do you know what I mean? That's why I get confused, because I just think, yes, we say that it's we say that it is bad, ADHD is bad because it's getting in the way of the project. But we also say it's normal because we don't think that stigmatizing people is good. And I'm not saying we're doing a good job of that, or society, not we, but is not doing a very good job of it, because it just makes a conflation and it confuses everyone and it normalizes something that doesn't need to be normalized in the first place. Because, as you were saying before, I'm not going to try and repeat what you were saying. But to me, I don't know, it's just not so hard and fast. I just see people not making very good judgments necessarily, but the fact they're normalizing and demonizing at the same time shows that this process of each situation posits its own moral conundrum. Each child has its own, I don't know. That's why I think that claiming something is bad is not the same as claiming something is good, to me.
Yeah, it's not the same, but it's still a value judgment, and it comes out of the reality of that which you're assessing, say. And so you have to make those assessments, and we have an institutional life that cuts off the ability to make that assessment. So we agree with that, right? That I what you said is beautifully said, and I totally agree that is a successful, a good, a well-lived life of, as Angus was mentioning, of individuating, becoming more and more who you are, as Zak says in a previous video, through the deepening of the subjective, we deepen into reality. And then the next video, they talk about that which is transcends the merely personal, right? That which is as a transcendent, as existing on all three levels of skill development, ensoulment, and transcendence. That we can transcend the personal. I totally agree with all that, and we have an is-ought problem in our society, because we have an it-ought problem, because we've objectified nature and we can't get out of it. We institutionally can't get out of it. You and I can. Angus can, clearly, right? I have to. I still have to fight for that in my child's Waldorf school, right? The secularization of Waldorf schools is flattening out methodology that would engender spiritual growth, from starting with the will and then moving through and so the pressures of society are even creeping into a movement that's meant to actually foster exactly what you're describing.
Yeah, I guess I'm just what was it? I think Zak talks about being in situations where you can disconfirm who you think you are and how you think reality is. And I guess I haven't been in enough of those situations in my life. So this problem hasn't become so clear to me, because I'm still in that maybe naive young person. If everyone just thought like me, it'd be fine. And I'm sure that everyone does think like me. So I guess that's where my confusion is stemming from.
One of the things that I'm hearing what you're saying, Kate, is what Zak talks about the 70-minute mark, where Greg's been talking about good and evil and Star Wars, and Zak's comment is like what you're talking to is like one of the deepest meta-ethical questions. So like there is, and John actually brings in something that begins to approach what we would recognize as like aligned with anthroposophical ideas, because John starts talking about flourishing versus self-destructive behaviors. So like, and that being the way of assessing whether sort of like the transformation, you should do the transformation or not. And Steiner talks often about the unhelpfulness of talking about good and evil, but instead of using the adjectives healthy versus unhealthy, understanding the consequences, not banishing and sort of like this final black and white judgment, that is good and that is bad. That doesn't take you anywhere. It's understanding how and when it's good, but how actually the same phenomena in another circumstance could actually be an unhealthy, lead to an unhealthy development. And I do find it interesting that John, he gets there, but then that's like, so that potentially fertile area to discuss, like, let's get away from good and bad, or good and evil is actually the words they use, and start talking about healthy and unhealthy. And I think that could have been a useful avenue to go down, but they were throwing around so many ideas that they didn't manage to settle to my satisfaction on digging down into that, which can actually, I believe, lead somewhere, and begin to sort of tackle the question you were talking about there. It isn't good or bad. It's like, how is it healthy? How is it unhealthy?
Yeah. I'm just honestly just openly confused and trying to share what's going on in my mind from my subjective point of view. So thank you for trying to bring that back to the conversation. Thank you.
Are we next clip there, Jeff? Yeah. Okay.
Visualization and possibly even philosophy in the sense of like religio.
Yep.
And so one more thing I'll drop in the mix was just the issue of measurement. And this is important to remember, that so much of what got modern science going and what made it so kind of frightening to the piety of the Kantian ethic was the demonstrable power of using measurement with mathematics to model physical events, and just how that changed the nature of the game very fundamentally. It was the experimental method, but it was specifically advances in measurement which allowed for objectification and a different kind of possibility for mathematical modeling. And so what that means is that when we're talking about is ought, usually when we're talking about is, we're often talking about some form of measured reality if you're looking at the sciences.
Right.
In everyday life, we talk about it's that we're not measuring, but we actually assume that we could measure them.
Right.
And in the sciences, you're looking at statistics and you're looking at other things. And so the primacy of measurement in thinking about the nature of ontology has limited us in thinking about what is ontologically real in these unmeasurable domains.
I'd like to take us back to Kant for a hot second to frame this, because Kant responded to Hume, who laid down this Isot naturalistic fallacy, and he foresaw that the religious life was going to be supervened on by the scientific life, and he wanted to create a moral categorical framework for an ethical framework to preserve the sanctity, say, of religious life. The problem is that he just stepped on the gas pedal for the Humean approach, because goes back to my introduction, because it placed the thing in itself as the reality in order to keep the reality from supervening on the religious impulse. And it never developed a real religious impulse. This is why Steiner answers Kant in the philosophy of freedom and in Truth and Knowledge. In Truth and Knowledge, he starts out by saying we suffer from an unhealthy faith in Kant. Right? Interestingly, he uses the term faith there. So that to me sets up this picture that also, it's interesting to me, and I'll just make this comment and leave room for others, but that Zak says in the sciences, we usually think of that which is measured, but there's nothing real that can be measured. So we're confusing what is real with what is scientifically, say, discoverable through measurement, right? And then of course he really lays into the notion that you can measure this ensoulment and transcendent aspects, right, as a device, but it also calls into question measurement itself, in my opinion. That what we measure we think is real, but it's not. It's the objectification. Measurement is very helpful in mechanics, in the development of technologies, and being able to do really cool shit like going to the moon, right? But that's, again, we conflate science with an ability to do something. I mean, I've brought this up before, but is the bomb we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is that science? No, it's not science. It's engineering and mechanics, and it's also mucking around in mysterious forces that are only half understood. This is why spiritual science, and I think he establishes this epistemologically and states it in Philosophy of Freedom, is necessary for all the other sciences. Bless you.
Yeah.
What was the minute mark on that one? You're muted. I can't hear you. Can you hear him?
Yeah, no, sorry, I pressed mute on my thing. I'm trying to kill flies here. 2850 to 30.
Okay, all right, good. That helps with context.
Do you want to move to the next one?
Yes, pragmatism.
Yeah. Okay.
And Dewey, and Casper talks about Dewey, because pragmatism is a project that blurs the epistemic and the normative completely, utterly, and it's paradoxical that most of the where epistemology has generally gone to, I don't think this is controversial. It's largely pragmatism as the grounding is epistemology. But in pragmatism, again, there is no fundamental distinction between truth and goodness. That's the core of pragmatism. There's a special definition given to goodness, and that definition is supposed to be also constitutive of how you seek the truth. I mean, this is clear in James. First is a little bit different. I get that, but it's clear in James, right? And so again, and this is what Putnam's argument is. We've got we for all the excellent reasons Zak said, we need to keep them apart. And Enlightenment had this wonderful, simple, way. Well, they're impossible to put together. So don't even try. The problem is, you have the Platonic critique, and you have the pragmatic critique, and in a weird way that would really bother both James and Plato, they seem to be converging on a point about, right, at the deepest levels, we can't properly separate these two. And so this is just a way of refining the question in terms of what Zak said, and now taking it deeper. How do we simultaneously acknowledge what I would argue this Case-Spear is ultimately pointing to, he doesn't get here, I'm taking him farther, that there's this common origin. How do we, and this sounds like a developmental question, right? How do we reconcile the common origin with the needed differentiations?
Great.
Thinking, spirit, the spiritual life and the spiritual world, and all of the complex ontology that one can maybe not experience, but at least first expose oneself to, so one can theorize a little bit into confirming or disconfirming, and then reality's pushed back a little bit further, a little bit broader. That which underlies, it's interesting too here that he sneaks in truth and goodness, because it's not. So the is the truth in this case. It's playing the role of the truth. It's in previous it was the is-ought, or it was the good bad, or it was the normative versus the scientific, say, or that sort of thing. Truth.
Yeah, well, I would just say those are different things. Truth and beauty and goodness are isomorphic, using a new word. At the highest or at the deepest level, whatever direction you want to look at. But these smaller atomized judgments that we make are not bringing all of. Are they? I don't know. I just don't know.
Yeah, to me that this is coming close to the need for the conversation to go into what truth is, what goodness is, and what beauty is, and then you're talking about reality, right?
Mm.
So if it's true, then it must be reflecting reality, or it must be participating in reality. If it's an articulated truth, say, if it's goodness, it means it's performing to its fullness, or something like that, right? Like good, yeah. Is it good? Yeah, it's really good. God made the world in 6 days, and then he said that's good. That's very good, right?
Good.
We create ourselves through the percept concept liminal process, and we know what goodness is.
Yes, is that possibly? Could we bring beauty into this? Why do we leave it out? Because in Crime Buell, he talks about that, how Kant didn't trust or didn't use the feeling life as a valid space of evaluating, and kind of boxed up all feeling of pleasure into a kind of sensual pleasure. And so we can't say that we act out of pleasure, because that means that we're acting out of empirical or animalistic causes. But there is a type of pleasure in being healthy, in doing the good, in rising higher and striving. That's also a pleasure in itself, which is different. And I think that's where beauty comes in. Where do we feel that when you see something beautiful, that it is true and it is really good and it's healthy, and you want to respond to it, and something in your soul wants to respond to it and rise as high as that beautiful thing. And that's in the feeling world that exists in our subjectivity between making moral judgments and making judgments about, well, having moral knowledge and knowledge about the given, where the moral knowledge comes from me and the given comes from without. but the knowledge happens in me either way. And there's an experience that has to be beautiful in that. If we bring the beauty into this, I think it will be easier to make this less confusing. I think we're losing it because we think because we've demonized subjectivity.
I agree with that absolutely wholeheartedly, and this is good because it's coming up in relationship to pragmatism. And my argument has always been that pragmatism is an apology for the Enlightenment. It's essentially right. The death of God happens, and so we just need to rationalize our way through it, as if there was a spiritual life, as if beauty had an actual real role to play, say in child development, for example. Like pragmatism ends in utilitarianism. And I grew up in Flint, Michigan. It's a Rust Belt town. I love the people. They're gritty. They have a depressive realism that comes later. There's a sort of inbred warmth, but a exterior hardness and all. But it's a factory town. It is the embodiment culturally of utilitarianism. There was no beauty in the design. It was all the way in which the factories influenced the ways in which schools were formed, and the ways in which the town was designed. There's some beautiful, architecture built by people with fabulous wealth, but it wasn't interior to the design of the institutions there. And in my own household, my dad was extremely utilitarian person. Didn't see the reason for any kind of bringing beauty into the home, say. And so I want to frame this from a Waldorf perspective, if I can. That is that children learn goodness not by and they get into this a little bit later in a super abstract way, but they learn goodness not by us teaching them virtues. Goodness is, I'm a little scarred on this issue because when I was in Boston, Massachusetts, I called into a really great show that I just had so much respect for the host. His name was Christopher Lydon, and the show was called The Connection. And they were talking about teaching virtue in school. And I said, well, the Waldorf school puts virtue on the back burner. And as a cook, I meant this in a very positive way. And I got shut down right away. It's like, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. That's not what the Waldorf school does. And I was in teacher training at the time, in Waldorf teacher training. But in any case, it is put on the back burner because it's a recipe. And the children learn that the world is good because they get the kind of feedback loop that Zak talks about later, and they're learning in leaps and bounds because they're meeting reality with an inherent ability to meet reality. And so as long as that's not interrupted by some of the problems we've described, this soundness of a sense of what is good, what is right, what is purposeful, what meets reality with strong imagination that they themselves are building. Okay, and so that's a long way around to get to beauty. So what role does beauty play? It's an education of the feeling life, right? It's an education of the deepening relationship with the goodness of reality. And so you become more intimate through this subjectification process that only art can achieve. And so Waldorf is taught, every subject is taught through art, as you know. And it's not a airy-fairy notion or an impractical or utilitarian notion, but we look at it that way, right? And so art is gluing macaroni on a page when I was a kid. It's like it's arts and crafts, and something you did in church
it's
because
expressing yourself.
Yeah, right, exactly, because you want to be an individual. So anyway, yes, so that whole 7 to 14, those whole middle years are an education of the feeling life, and as through the participation in creating beautiful things and appreciating beautiful things. So I second that. Right, we have the.
Well,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. This brings in what I was talking to you about art and anthroposophy, because the judgments about aesthetics, about what is true about color and form, are also, I would argue, what is in color and form is also what ought to be. And that happens in beauty when you learn how to do it correctly. Well, it's not learn how to do it correctly, actually. When you paint, and Steiner talks about this in his lectures on color, which are my favorite lectures, you are painting out of the color. You get to know the color. You get to know what the color is. And as the isness of the color reveals itself to you, what you ought to do with the color is also evident. You know? And I think that in spiritual science, a lot of the facts that we can get out of spiritual science are also because they are facts about processes. Steiner's always talking about processes. They are what ought to be as well. They are doing what they ought to be. And in color and in art, that is so evident to me because you're always painting out of the color. You're not putting. You can. It's possible to just draw and put color wherever you like. But when you have a really when you're in your feeling and you're painting, and it's just an objective truth that yellow is the way yellow is, and red is the way red is, and green is the way green is, and if you have green and blue next to each other, it creates a feeling in you that is true, and you can say, do I want to create that feeling in this picture? Does that create a good picture? And in art, you're doing all three all the time, just being immersed in the reality of color and of line and form and gesture. So, and I think the beginnings of modern art was really great to remove, well, not remove, but to put convention and formality of art, which had developed amazingly over the last, in the Enlightenment centuries. The things that we could do with art were amazing. But it's sort of, is it enough to just reproduce reality in exactly as it is? Not really, because then what's the point of it? We have reality already. If I can copy reality perfectly, it's just, it doesn't have to exist. My artwork doesn't have to exist. But if I can get into the feeling, the aesthetic feeling of art, and which I think modern art was looking for in Expressionism and Impressionism, they were trying to, what is actually the feeling of this that I'm trying to recreate? And how do I be honest and true to that feeling? How do I create a good representation of that? And so the beginnings of modern art, I suppose, express yourself was first be honest to the feeling that it creates. And then but then it got ruined because we decided beauty is not real. Beauty is subjective, but it's not, it's not real.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That's right. Well, and that's what Waldorf education is there to do, is to make that which is subjective more real, increasingly more real, because then you have a relationship with a self that you move around in the world as an adult, as opposed to a legitimacy crisis and a sense-making crisis. It makes sense what you're saying. It's sense-making to do art in a certain sense, sense-creating, in a way, enlivening, and that's again what he speaks about in Riddles of Humanity, is the way in which the life processes enliven the sense. Help to enliven the senses, and we, as you ensoul the life processes through art in a special way. And so we have the technology.
We do.
Yes. That's beautifully said. That really layered in much more nuance than what I was saying in a sort of more broad, general child development way.
Well, I'm doing this right now. I'm learning how to paint. I'm experimenting, and I just love color. And I would be really, I wish I could ask these three guys, well, if you're talking about truth and goodness, where does beauty come in? What is, I would love to ask them that.
Yeah. I mean, I think Zak would say it comes in the ensoulment.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it also comes in it's there in every, they're in each other, truth, goodness, and beauty. And we could do hours just on truth, goodness, and beauty, unpacking what that means, right? Because it's reality. It's the ground of reality that's expressing itself in those three different ways. They represent three different ontological realms, even.
Yeah.
I think we can go ahead.
How would you how does thinking come into contact with beauty, would you say? Because I don't really know.
You mean joy, I would say. Like
Yeah.
I think of thinking maybe as right now I'm thinking of the Ode to Joy as a triumphant, relatable to chapter 12 of Philosophy of Freedom. It's when thinking is in harmony with the 12 worldviews, say. When it's a symphony of multi-perspectival creation. When you're an artist in concepts, as Steiner refers to any true philosophy. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. So 37 there, Jeff, yeah?
Yes, is that right? 3747?
3740, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Point being made there. Okay, I'll shut up.
I'll offer some thoughts in relation. So, for me, obviously I'll put it sort of in a U-talk frame. So on the one hand, we have the issue of lived experience and the nature of lived beings, which I would argue the nature of lived beings fuses is an ought. I mean, to be a being in the world is a complex adaptive system. You have to decipher what is and what is relevant in relationship to what then to metabolize to then what moves to your capacity to maintain your complex adaptive design. So the process of activity, and you see it, I mean, we can go all the way up to humans and say, Descartes' error in relationship. And if you short circuit the valuation system, people just don't move, basically.
Yeah.
There's no, the intellectual capacity can solve problems, but it actually, in order to be in the world, and this then moves up to behavioral investment theory, which is very similar, of course, to recursive relevance realization, says, hey, the nervous system's an investment value system. Right? It's the whole approach avoidance, pleasure, pain architecture is for the organism to be plugged into, this is good for me and this is bad for me. So the lived experience of being an animal and then into a primate affords the capacity to fuse is and ought from the perspective in the context, the situational developmental context of the organism. It has an inbred valued structure. That's the nature of existence in relation. So at that level, there's a fusion. And then what Zak said, and then I would say, from my vantage point, then what emerges on top of that layer is a layer of propositional reflection, the problem of justification. And then when we drop propositional justifications and then create the negative space of the question, then I would argue that, what analytic or epistemological reflection gets us to through first Socrates, whatever, into science is actually the kinds of justification that afford legitimizing our ontology and the degree of accuracy questions. Like this is a good coherent correspondence network of propositions that describes and explains what is in the world relative to a normative articulation that legitimizes this is what we ought to do are two very different kinds of justification systems that are used to legitimize those particular types of claims. And fundamentally, that's the way I hear the defensible sort of Humean frame, which is basically, yay, the kinds of justification that are involved in legitimizing accuracy is questions are different fundamentally than the kinds of justifications that are involved to legitimize shared normative moral claims. So that
Well, that was painful.
Yeah, I wrote on my paper, transcendence killed. I said, you've heard that I haven't been contributing much. It's
Yeah, I know. I'm inclined to slide right past this because I can see that you're not in your normal spirited manner trying to read.
So I can't be bothered. I can't be bothered with them.
So, but I would like to make a brief comment about it, which is that this is indicative of the process of linear evolutionary biology narrative. Starting with single cell organisms, and he does this big history thing again, even though I think Zak decidedly refuted the sort of absolutized narrative that it produces, but it grinds all down into the nervous system, which is dead. It grinds down into the justification system that's supposedly attached to a nervous system that has no such function. It doesn't function that way. The nervous system is where life dies in us. And it's the process, speaking of thinking and beauty, it's the process where we resurrect life into thinking, right? So thinking is the thing that arises that at that moment. Justification systems are a abstract theoretical, and because they're abstract and not theoretical in the sense that it can be tested out, they're just a claim, and so we're left with so morality is a wrestling match between two justification systems, and he leaves open that the question can be brought in to overcome the justification system in some way, but he doesn't. There's no originating activity as relates to this. It's just the momentum of the evolution and the inertia of the way in which justification systems sort of are radiating out of a nervous system or some other such superstitious notions.
I think I've identified what it is that's really bugging me here. Is we haven't when they're going on about this, they haven't moved on from the second one. We're supposed to be talking about transcendence here, and they aren't. They're stuck in intellectualizing the problem, which has value, theorizing the problem. But they're still in the second video. Sorry, yeah.
I don't think that they believe that transcend. Well, I don't think John or Gregg believe that transcendence has anything to do with the Isot question. I think they've taken this as a specific and distinct. And so the next video is about transcendence.
Mm. Well, at the end, Gregg says there's a difference between making accurate judgments and making judgments about what we collectively decide is normal. And I suppose with philosophy of freedom, we say, yeah, but then there's also another different realm where we decide what to do for ourselves, not based on what everyone thinks is normative. Which makes me think of From Normal to Healthy. It's such a good title for a book.
Yeah, Georg Kuhlevin. Yeah.
Yeah, for Georg Kuhlevin.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked that part out because then this calls in. Not only do I call into question the whole notion of the justification system. I mean, it could be a useful metaphor, but that it's not used that way. It's used in a way that truncates reality into this evolutionary biological process only bound to a biological process. No spiritual agency associated with that at all. And if to somebody who doesn't know about Steiner, that seems reasonable. But if there is a a relationship with spiritual reality, for lack of a better way to put it, just to flatten out the description, because that's a very complex thing with Steiner. It's also complex with Sri Aurobindo. If that's the case, then you can't fall into this this abstract notion of what justification is, and particularly what you're saying, normative. Like implied in normative is this idea that they all three seem to accept, which is that the social world is a world that is the absolute medium out of which we exist. It's almost a 100% nurture argument, and that's our 100% medium, and that all of our internal life is just a internal sort of reverse projection into what our how we think about things and the language we use and that sort of thing. And that is that's an anathema to philosophy of freedom. It's an anathema to freedom and spiritual autonomy.
Anathema to freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, but I think if I don't even think you need Steiner, because I think if you have a really like moral feeling, and I suppose you just have to be less afraid of religion. I am not afraid of religion, and in the social organism is so important in religion, but one's own experience of, I mean, I'm a Christian, so my experience of Christ I know is personal to me, and I come together with other people to, I guess, see if I can use that experience normatively, but I don't base my judgment solely off what other, it is an unfolding process that I know I can't be, no one's going to give me the answers to.
Right. And you can't get the answers sitting alone in a monastery or by yourself in your room. It's the inversion. What they're describing is the inversion of reality, which is that we go into social circumstances in order to discover together something that is not discoverable alone. Not only that, but that is a higher discovery at each level of discovery in relationship to the refining intelligence that you're in association with.
Because I trust that my thinking is individual, but the source that it comes from is universal, and that is revealed when I do spiritual work with other people or talk about things with other people. And it is I think it is revealed in more, for me, Christianity, it's loving your neighbor is trusting that as yourself, is trusting that they have the same access to the spiritual ground of being, and that it can only come through in an individualized way. But I don't know. Yeah.
And that when you're with your neighbor and they're sharing, you're hosting their thinking, as Orland Bishop might say.
Yeah.
You're hosting their thinking in your where your thinking usually occurs. Then that's where the Christ is living between you, right? And so then you're both having a universalizing experience, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a side note, but I remember when we read the chapter about, I think it's the end, I think it's the appendix of Philosophy of Freedom. He talks about when you listen to another person talk or reveal themselves through their speech, your thoughts are paused to make a home for their thoughts. And at first I thought, that's not true. But it so is. It's so true. And like to actually truly listen means that I have to quiet myself. And that experience is the same as listening to my intuition, quieting the chatter so that it can come through. And so only through other people is that reality kind of revealed. I guess that's what normativity is. Yeah.
It's spiritual normativity, right?
It's spiritual normativity.
It's
Yeah.
also equilibration. It's equilibrating with reality, which is a vibrational reality that's higher than any singular vibration. Say from a musical standpoint, say when you brought in our art, visual art, and color, and music is the same thing. This is why in Waldorf schools strings are taught in the middle years when the feelings are just starting to arise, and they start with the violin because it's the most like the human voice. What do you people say with your accents? Respiratory. It's
Respiratory.
Oh, you do. Okay. Angus, say.
Yeah, no, I said the same as like respiratory.
You do? Okay. All right.
Yeah.
That's correct from a Midwestern American. in any case, this is another layer of the spiritual as pure information that's available for human beings through thinking, music, and color.
Yeah. And they talked about this last time, this last video. How do we know that we're on the right track? Well, we self-correct. It's not measurement that shows us what is true. It's our ability to self-correct.
Okay. I think we have a partner itching to go. So go ahead and introduce your last clip, and we'll part with that.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I chose this clip because, well, how am I gonna?
Where are we? The one that's 65, 105, Kate.
Yeah, 105.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So this comes about because John talks about the onto-epistemic project being an educational project. And then Zak kind of builds on that and in the great way that he does. And I chose the specific length because John says something very cool. I like the word that he uses. He uses the word normativity or something. He uses as in the archetypal, which we like because I like because of Goethe. And it was just like, yes, you're in the stream that I'm also writing in because what Kant did when he capped off knowledge that we can never know how things truly are meant that education, or to me, education in that mindset is I've learned as much as I can in the subject, and I'm going to give that information to you. But if we say that there is no limit to knowledge, that we can continue to keep learning, and that is fundamental in our human striving is to learn and to know, then the educational project is let's learn together at our own levels and do life together and figure things out together. And I just wish that high school education was like that for me. And so I think what they're touching on here about education being the fundamental human project is true if we don't believe in a thing in itself. If we believe that there's no limit to knowledge and we can know. So which is what Steiner brings in philosophy of freedom.
Okay.
Thought basically to overgeneralize Dewey's point. And so the primacy of education as a human endeavor follows from the primacy of learning as a philosophical concern in the domains of epistemology and ontology.
Yes.
And so the merger of those two again, back to Plotinus, right? Gives us that relation between being and knowing as primordial. And then when you think of knowing as this thing which is socially mediated and developmental, then you end up getting also these, when we talked about last time, like the disclosure of more reality through the engagement of certain kinds of practices in social community. And so we talked last time about the forms of imaginal practice that allow for better detection of actually real things in the world.
And then to do the Neoplatonic argument, that's bound up with the autopoiesis of culture, of civilization, right? Those two are bound up together, and there's kind of this normativity of keep the culture, keep the civilization going, because everything else we want to do depends on that in a fundamental way.
Do you want to say anything? I don't know what to say.
Yes, normativity is a beautiful word in this case. I hadn't really internalized that. Also, because it speaks to what we were just talking about, which is that it's the only normativity there fucking is. Everything else is public opinion, right? And public opinion we know is used in a really authoritarian fashion right now. And so trying to achieve normativity is gruel, as Jordan Peterson might say. And then the other thing is I think Zak nails the end beautifully to me, in that it's being and knowing. There is no isness without being, and so being is inherently real, obviously, and anything that's not being is likely unreal or an artifact of reality.
Yeah,
that's a good summary. I think, not me, but I think that clip is a good way to end this.
Yeah, but do you know what I do you think I'm right in that intuition that they are going in our direction because they are thinking of it as an unfolding evolutionary process, rather than that they don't have that Kantian cap on knowledge when they talk like that?
Yes. And they self-impose limits, John and Greg, because they bind that evolutionary process to hard biology and culture. And culture as a natural selective process or something like that. Is a natural selective normative process based on justification systems. So that's a self-limiting thing that Angus is experiencing, is very frustrating throughout this whole video, right? And so they've displayed their self-limitations here, which is really interesting. It's a really interesting relief. I don't mean like, oh, I'm so relieved, but I mean like the cleaving between what is a real way to look at morality and this tortured manner in which they tried to make naturalism fit into the morality box and the being box, for that matter.
And this was in contrast to such a good, in my opinion, obviously, good video last time, where it really felt like they were moving forward, talking about things going. Do you know what? You got engaged in the conversation. You felt yourself agreeing with them a lot. And here, I died.
This is why it's so fucking important, because this is the best. These are some of the Zak and John, Zak particularly. These are some of the best minds in our contemporary culture. Right, and I really have a lot of respect and a lot of reverence for their rigor in their efforts here, and this is the place where they hit a brick wall, because their self-limitations are most exposed here, and it's the place that society needs those answers more than anywhere else in all of the conversations we've had. So hopefully we've provided a little bit of help there.
Well, it comes to beauty again, faced with this. I mean, especially the end of this video. I think that the clip that I just showed is the height, and then it descends into, I don't even know. I was listening to it last night, so confused about why it just seemed to. It was like they had dropped a piece of toast and it landed jam side down. That's how it felt.
What a waste of jam.
Yeah, it was just, I didn't get it. But I think the opportunity, like, where can we plug in and where can we make it feel beautiful again? I suppose I'm really running with this. Like, that's how you fix the Isot. Is like, well, how can we make it beautiful? I'm gonna become an aesthetic essentialist or something. And that's gonna get me in trouble. But that's just the like, you're faced with this thing that feels wrong, but that doesn't mean that we should abandon it.
No, I agree. Have you read Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man by Schiller?
No, I want to.
Me too. I just got it. I just got it because, and I keep meaning to do so because of Philosophy of Freedom, and he points to this as an ultimate way to think about that aspect, aesthetics, as part of the transformative and its relationship to truth and goodness as relates to education.
That's where he develops the idea of Spieltrieb and Formtrieb. So these ideas of drives, play drive and formative. I don't know. Again, I'm not sure of the English terms in there, but it's like at the heart of where freedom lies.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shall we wrap it up there?
Yeah.
Lord, yes.
Sure.
Okay, I'll just press the end recording.